Namaste. On behalf of Vibha and Vigyan Prasar, I welcome you all in the lecture series on Swatantrata Sangram and Vigyan in commemoration of Amrut Mahotsav of our country. This is the third lecture of this series. Our country got Swatantrata in 1947, and around 200 years period we were colonized by Britishers, and Britishers tried to thrust that we don't have acumen for science. But our scientists, did not leave this place, and they tried very hard and advanced science in our country. Today, in this third lecture of the series, Professor V.V. Krishana ji, who is the Fellow of Royal Society at New South Wales University, Australia, will speak over Colonial Model and Emergence of National Science in India. Dr. Chandrabhash Narayan, who is the director of Rajiv Gandhi Center for Biotechnology, Thiruvananthapuram, will preside over the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, Professor Krishana will also be taking questions. So you should post your queries or questions during the lecture on the YouTube comment box. Like last time, we'll also be circulating a feedback form during the lecture. Kindly fill the form. We'll send a transcript if you want to get it and the related material. Now I invite Ranjana ji, Sanyojika of the Amrut Mahotsav for Vigyan Bharati, for formal welcome and introduction. Dr. Ranjana ji.
Thank you very much, Professor Ruchir Gupta. Dear Dr. Chandrabhash Narayana, Director, Rajiv Gandhi Center for Biotechnology, Thiruvananthapuram, who has very kindly agreed to preside over today's lecture. Dear Dr. Venni Venkata Krishana, from New South Wales University, Sydney, Australia. He is the eminent speaker today. Maniya Janji Sahasrabuddhe, National Organizing Secretary of Vibha. Professor Ruchir Gupta, Dean Engineering from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi. And all the dear participants who are attending this third lecture of the series, Swatantrata Sangram Evam Vigyan. As all of us know, that our Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji on 12th March 2021, which is, the anniversary of Dandi March also, a very prominent day for all Indians for the freedom struggle. So on March 12, 2021, Modi ji announced that as we are entering into the Platinum Jubilee year, next 15th August 2022, we will be completing our, Platinum Jubilee of independence. So he said, we should celebrate this festival for 75 weeks. So from 12th March, he started that movement, and it should be celebrated so that it become a people movement across the country, and people should appreciate, the freedom we are enjoying, how many people have contributed to that freedom struggle. So several government departments, ministries are celebrating this event with the gusto it deserves. In the same spirit, Vigyan Bharati, which is a Swadeshi Vigyan Andolan, and a biggest organization of scientists, technocrats, engineers, medicines, medicos, not only in India but also abroad. They are all targeting to work for science of India, science for India. So Vigyan Bharati is also celebrating this Swatantrata ka Amrit Mahotsav, and we want to bring create that narrative into the society that science and scientists also played a very important role, because generally not even scientists believe that, or they do not have exposed to this idea that what freedom means, what Swatantrata means. For them also it was like people who contributed majorly through satyagrahas, civil disobedience, and revolutionaries, social reformers. They believe those were the people who contributed to the freedom struggle, and science or scientists didn't play any role. But through this series, we want to create this narrative into the society and into the उनके मन में एक भाव ये जगाना कि हमारे वैज्ञानिकों ने उस वक्त वेस्टर्न साइंस जो the Britishers used that science to exploit our resources. Basically, they were not doing a favor to us. They wanted to educate us science. That was not their purpose. So our scientists took, a very serious view of those colonial Western science and created their own nationalism in the domain of science. And I'm very pleased that since last two lectures, we are having very, eminent scholars of that field. Professor Deepak Kumar was the first one, and then Jantji gave his views very explicitly. And today we have with us Professor Venni V. Krishnan with us, who is also expert of this field. And I'm very happy that when I contacted Dr. Krishna, he, so enthusiastically accepted my invitation and agreed to deliver the talk today. I do understand he is in Australia 4.5 hours ahead to Indian Standard Time. It is an inconvenient time for him. But I think this is also his, belongingness to the country, his feeling for the nation, that he wanted to be with us on a very special moment, Swatantrata Sangram Emam Vigyan. Very briefly, I would like to his profile. It's very enriched profile, very difficult to say each and everything. But I would like to share with my audience that Dr. Krishna is currently a professorial fellow at School of Humanities and Languages at the University of New South Wales, and also honorary professor of School of History and Philosophy of Science, Sydney University, Sydney. He has been elected as the Fellow of Royal Society, New South Wales, very recently in 2009. Very pleased to share with you that before moving to Australia, he was professor in science policy and chair, Center for Studies in Science Policy, School of Social Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, for more than 20 years. And I do believe that he was also associated with CSIR NISTADS at some point of time. I'm very glad to say that. He has more than 30 years of research, teaching, and consultancy experience in science and technology policy studies, history and sociology of science and technology, innovation studies and science, technology and developing world in leading academic and research institutions in India and so many countries, a long list. He has more than 40 research papers to his credit, and he has written down 7 books which are very well acclaimed books and followed by many academicians and researchers. So I'm very pleased that today he is with us, and he has chosen a very apt topic to our lecture series, that is colonial model and the emergence of national science in India. Particularly the period he has taken is 1876 to 1940. So I welcome you, Dr. Krishna. I'm thankful to you, and to Dr. Chandrabhas Narayana, who is with us presiding over the function. I believe he's a role model. He's having the best leadership capabilities, and eminent scientist. And people like him, when they are associated with us in this kind of program, I'm 100% sure that this narrative which Vibha is trying to create, that the scientists should have the feeling of nationalism and their contribution in the freedom struggle, he will take it to the much larger audiences and serving our purpose. I'm so thankful to you, Professor Narayana, to be with us. And with these words, I would like to invite Professor Krishna to deliver his talk. Thank you so very much.
At the outset, you able to hear me now? Yeah. At the outset, let me thank Dr. Ranjanaji, Director of NISTADS, Professor Chandrabhas Narayan, and Dr. Ruchir. Really, I'm glad that I'm able to be part of this series. since I worked in NISTADS, and I started my career at NISTADS and then to JNU and now in Sydney. But I keep working on Indian science and Indian scientific community. And this is one of the important topics on which is rightly relevant to the Vigyan Prasar and also the Vibha, which is the kind of the program which is going on. So without losing any more this thing, let me begin my talk. So I will open up the slides. My topic today is on the colonial model and the emergence of national science in India between 1870s and 1940s.
Professor Krishna, your slides are not visible.
I've already shared the slides.
Okay. Praveen ji, can you share the slides? I will just see to it. Professor Krishna, you may continue for the. I will.
Yeah. Shall I continue or?
It has come. Now it has come. Now it has come.
Now it is shared. You can start.
I can operate. Yeah. Now you can see the slides. Yeah.
Yes, we can. We can.
Yeah. Yeah. Today I'm going to talk on the colonial model and the emergence of national science in India between 1870s and 1940s. This is the period, as we go on, you will appreciate that 1870s is the period when 1870 I've chosen because Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science was inaugurated in 1876. And 1940s is the period by when the whole concept of national science has completely emerged. As we go on, we will appreciate much more on that one. First of all, what is colonial science? We all know that the rise of the modern Western science in Asia, Africa, and Latin America came about as a part of the colonization process. The British, the Dutch, French, Spanish all came to different places. Scientific expeditions followed imperial flags. Joseph Banks, who was a naturalist and botanist, he was in the Captain Cook's voyage, who claimed Australia and New Zealand. In India, it began with the establishment of the East India Company around the middle of the 18th century. Colonial science from the mid-19th century, it had both the constructive and the dysfunctional or the destructive aspects. This is totally a different topic, but only to flag that there are both the constructive and the dysfunctional aspects which are there. I'm just flagging it. India, in fact, was a jewel in the British crown, but it was also a social and the political laboratory to test, train institutions and personnel and export experts from the country. The colonial science is more than a set of institutions or structures. It's an economic as well as a cultural intervention. Next slide. When you look into the whole colonial science and the number of people who have written on that one, you have a number of people like George Basala, who wrote a classic paper on the spread of the Western science, which led to the whole debate and the discourse among the historians of science on the spread of the Western science. Roy McLeod, Deepak Kumar, who already gave a lecture in this series, Michael Warboy, Sangster. These are some of the names which I am just mentioning. And Basala gave a three-stage model for the spread of the Western science. And one of the main issues of the Basala's model was that that before the spread of the Western science, there was no science in the peripheral colonial countries, which I'll be contesting to that thesis in this lecture. Before this transmission, colonial peripheries were non-science societies. This was one of the main conclusions he gave. The whole mission of the colonialists were also the civilizing mission through the colonial science. If you look in the whole civilization mission, which was much more in the French Africa from the French colonialism, rather than the British colonialism. Before we get into some of the lecture, there are many basic concepts. We'll briefly clear it. The term national is used here in an interpretative way from a sociological sense of the term, which means that it's not my term. It's the term which was used by Mahendra Lal Sarkar, which was used by P.C. Ray, it was used by M.N. Saha, and many of the eminent Indian scientists. So the term I'm using, national science, is in that sense. And national science here, basically, they meant for the building of the Indian scientific base or the nation building. The concept of scientific community is very important. Scientific community doesn't mean just buildings and the money and infrastructure. It is an intellectual base, and it is the kind of a sense of community and specialization. And it also means the advancement of knowledge and flagging your own national within the international sphere of science. And science, there are two concepts which are there, which are the institutionalization of the science and the professionalization of the science. Institutionalization is when institutions are created. If, for instance, the Geological Survey of India, the Botanical Survey of India, the number of institutions which were created around 18th century, it doesn't mean that the science is professionalized. The science is professionalized only when there is a kind of advancement of the sciences. There are specialist groups, there are research laboratories, and there is an intellectual base, and there are journals and number of things which are there. We all know there are also the basic science, applied science, development science, and exploration and the surveys. The concept of colonial science, there is also two concepts, the metropolis and the center. The metropolis is generally referred to London or Paris or some of those eminent cities where the real science was going on at that particular point of time in the 18th and the 19th century, which is called the center. And the periphery are basically the colonies which are there. The colonies are periphery for explanation of the flora and the fauna. Basically, the colonial science was such that the peripheries were used more for the survey kind of research, botanical survey, geological survey, and many of those things, where there was a division of labor between the center and the periphery. And while much of the data gathering activity and the survey research goes on in the peripheries, the real synthesis takes place in the metropolis. That was the kind of the division of the labor which was there. Next slide, please. The colonial science, if you see from the mid-19th century, is basically the time. Of course, even though the Asiatic Society was created as early as the 1784, botanical surveys and the East India Company which was there, but it was only the Victorian government which came about in 1857. From 1857, that is the mid-19th century, you can really talk about the colonial science. Before that, it was only East India Company which was represented by the Queen Victoria. The major science expeditions, the technology, the whole essence of the colonial science was there was a huge technology projects. As we go on, I will mention some of those. The scientific surveys, the railways, the transportation, structured into colonial economic exploitation. You know, there are, as I mentioned, there are the positive and the negative aspect, the constructive and the destructive aspects. The huge technology projects, all these things came about as a colonization process, but these were unintended consequences which were which were to be introduced because of the colonial objectives, and they had to rule the country. By 19th century, the colonial science operated at its peak in India. The power passed from the East India Company to the Victorian government. More than 11 science enterprises were created. The 3 universities in the presidency towns of Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras were established by this time. Next slide. We had these 3 universities in the presidencies. The major projects in the railways, telegraphy was there. Between 1857 and 1961, 11,000 miles of telegraphy was established. It was important for the communications, and 1857 is also the period, they call it mutiny, and we call it the First War of Independence. So that was the kind of the importance for which technologies were introduced into the country. The forestry, the roads, the bridges, canals, dams, public works, buildings, engineering, institution. Thomson Engineering College, the Roorkee, is one of the most important ones. There were 11 major scientific services which were there. And now if we look into the whole, some of these technology projects and the institutions and the kind of the, of course, the 3 universities, what were the objectives, the structure and the organization of these enterprises. Next slide. The colonial science objectives, if we look into the objectives, it was basically an economic exploitation to aid British industrialization and generate surplus. Maintaining empire demanded development of large technological projects, as I already mentioned. Hence, unintended consequences for the India came about. The objectives of the colonial science, these given the objectives, much of the research, the content of the research were the science surveys. It was much of a data gathering activity in terms of the survey research, applied research synthesis, where while the metropolis was going on in the metropolis. If you look into the whole geological survey of India, they were exploring for the whole coal and other this thing. Of course, they were not exploring for the iron ore because they didn't want to develop the steel industry in India. When the coals in the coal, the much of these this thing was examinations were going on in the London actually at that particular point of time. There was a whole division of labor between the kind of the research which was done in the country and also what was going on in the Britain. So the structure, it was center and periphery was there. The example geological survey was there. The Thomson Engineering College. Basically, it was used as a kind of a social laboratory. And you will find that many of the overseers and many of the kind of the bridges and many of the engineering basic concepts were being developed in the country and used back into the kind of the whole Britain. In terms of the whole social organization, you will find that there was a large scale racial discrimination. Mostly applied research institutions were there, and they have institutionalized the science because a number of 11 scientific survey organizations have already been established, but it was not the colonial science did not support the professionalization. By professionalization, I mean the whole scientific communities advancing knowledge and journals, and many of those intellectual climate was not created. So in terms of the objectives, it was a clear economic exploitation. In terms of the structure, there was a division of labor between the center and the periphery. In terms of the social organization of the science, you will find that there was a whole racial discrimination. So the whole point of the colonial science was gatekeeping 11 scientific enterprises to keep the professionals out of high positions. Next slide, please. If you look into the kind of the slide which is here, because a lot of data is there and it is not very visible in terms of the whole. But what I have given in this table is this is a table with the source is the P.C. Ray's presidential address to the Indian Science Congress in 1920s. And he has given this a table where he said there are 11 scientific colonial scientific enterprises, botanical survey, geological survey, zoological survey, forest surveys, medical, bacteriological surveys, Indian munitions board, number of 11 scientific surveys over there. Here you will find there was something called a imperial grade for the scientists who were there, and there was an Indian grade. It was Indian Educational Service and the Imperial Education Service. And for the number of PC Ray also has given the kind of the pay which was drawn by the Europeans who were in these organizations and the Indians. You will find in many of the cases the kind of Indians who were there, they were drawing half the pay of the Britishers. So you can see the kind of the discrimination which was used by in many of these organizations. And Indians were, even though they were educated with the PhDs, and number of people like PC Ray, J.C. Bose, and many of these people who were M.N. Saha, who were trained abroad and who came back to India in the late 19th century, they were placed, they were given positions in the Indian Educational Service, and the Britishers who were with the lesser qualifications were given in the European Imperial Education Services, and the Indians were given half the salaries who were there in this thing. Hardly one or two Indians like J.C. Bose or somebody has gone into the Imperial Service, but even in those cases, they were given half the salaries. So there was a large-scale discrimination in terms of the services. There was a gatekeeping activity which was practiced by the colonial science, and the limitations of the colonial sciences one can see. For instance, if you take the example of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Dwaratnath Tagore, father of Rabindranath Tagore, became a member of this society. But to get the membership, he had to spend about after 50 years after the Asiatic Society was established, Dwaratnath Tagore became the kind of a member of this society. So Indians were kept out of the many of those institutions. Now, to understand the kind of the conditions within which the Indians worked within the colonial scientific enterprises, there's a typical case of P.N. Bose, who was a geologist, who was much more qualified than the director of Geological Survey of India at that particular point of time, Sir Thomas Holland. P.N. Bose wanted to do a lot of research on the iron ore, but he was not allowed. He was only allowed to do some kind of a data gathering activity within the kind of the coal services. As the case went on, P.N. Bose resigned from the Geological Survey of India when he was overtaken by the Sir Thomas Holland. Later on, he joins the Tatas, and he was one of the developers for the steel industry in India later on. Another important person was earlier who was head of the Geological Survey in 1880 was the Medlicott. Now, I will just read a quote from what Medlicott, his opinion about the Indian scientists. He said the Indians are incapable of any original work in natural sciences. He wanted to wait till the scientific chord among the natives was touched, and added that if indeed it exists yet in this variety of human race, so let us exercise a little discretion with our weaker brethren and not expect them to run before they can walk. So this was the kind of the views which Britishers have had about the Indian scientists. For instance, the first degree in science was established 1898, almost at the end of the 19th century. As we all know that the first universities were created by 1857 in the presidencies, but the first degree in the science was we got only in the 1898. That too after a 20-year struggle by people like P.C. Ray and Ashutosh Mukherjee and many of those people. As I already mentioned, the Imperial Education Service versus the Provincial Educational Services, where Indian scientists with the same qualifications were not given the Imperial Education Services. They were placed in the Provincial Education Services, which is also called the Indian Educational Services later on, and who were given half the salary. The science surveys created professionals, technicians, but stopped at the doors of the professionalization and the advancement of the sciences. Toward the end of the 19th century, several Indian scientists, engineers returning from UK, Europe found themselves frustrated in the provincial educational services without labs and a sense of intellectual community in science. So this is where, towards the end of the 19th century, you will find that the kind of the colonial science, which was in terms of the goal, in terms of the structure, in terms of the whole organization, which was quite discriminated and which was only they were keeping the gatekeeping activity. They have institutionalized the science. Their technology projects were there, but as far as the science, the professional science and the basic research and the advancement of science was there, it was not sort of allowed in many of those enterprises. So many of Indian scientists at the late 19th century who comes back from Britain feel completely frustrated, and they wanted to do something for the advancement of the sciences, and that's where this whole struggle begins towards the national science. Next slide, please. So what happens is, from around the late 1876, there's a breakaway from the colonial science toward the establishment, towards what the beginning of the national science, what we will say. If in 1784, if Asiatic Society is the institutionalization of the science, if we can take as a landmark, 1876 is the period when Indian Association of Cultivation of Science was established by Mahendra Lal Sarkar, and this is the beginning of the national science, or a kind of a new phase to about 1914, because again 1914 is a very important period. 1914 is the time when Indian Science Congress was established, this thing. So the period between 1876 and 1914, these 24, almost about 30 to 40 years were used to create a kind of a support structures toward creating a base for the national science in India. As I already mentioned, that the term national science, it was used by many of the scientists like P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, and many M.N. Saha, many of the people, for building nation through the science and technology promotion and the cultivation. So from the period between 1876 to 1914, a number of institutions, support structures were created. We will come to some of them. The first was since much of the science was in English, and in India, given the kind of the cultural diversities and the language diversities, one of the important functions where these people, these institutions like Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, and later on Bose Research Institute, and many of those institutions which came up, one of the first work they did was the popularization and the translation of science to the local languages. Later on, I will give a table which shows in the different regions, thousands and thousands of books were translated from the local languages to the English to the local languages. Secondly, they created number of specialized institutions. They created more than 6 to 7 universities by 1920s, and about the number of scholarships and higher training. Now, I'm not talking about these universities were created mostly from the kind of Indian money, which was donated from many of the rich people at that particular point of time. And after the Indian Science Congress was established in 1914, number of professional associations, journals, and societies and the specialist groups came up. We will get into some of those institutions. So what you will find after breakaway from the colonial science, you will find there is a kind of an important sociological stratification. Now, if you ask a question that who is a colonial scientist, during the colonial science, there were many British scientists like Sir Thomas Holland and Medlicott, who talked about the who had racial overtones. Sir Thomas Holland overtook P.N. Bose, who was much more qualified, but he was this thing. There was so these were basically the gatekeepers, gatekeepers in the sense that they will allow the institutionalization of the science, the progress of science to certain extent, but they would not allow the professionalization or the basic research, or the kind of the support which should be given to the basic research and for the creating the scientific communities and the specialist group, they will not do it. They will only restrict the science to the kind of the data gathering activity and do the survey research in terms of those 11 scientific survey research organizations which I already mentioned, which was there from the PC Ray's presidential address. So there were gatekeepers like Sir Thomas Holland and Medlicott, who talked about the racial science. And secondly, they were soldiers. I'm using this term soldiers. William O'Shaughnessy comes as a kind of a chemist to as early as the 1830s. To the Calcutta Tropical Medical College. But O'Shaughnessy is also credited, he was a Renaissance person. O'Shaughnessy was credited with helping the British government to create 11,000 miles of telegraphy between 1857 and 1961. But when his time is over, he will go back to this thing. So these people were given certain tasks, and they spent 10 to 12, 13, 14, 15 years in India, who acquired a lot of professional experience. As I told you that India was used as a social laboratory, and when they became experts, they went back to this thing. So metaphorically, they were acting just like the soldiers. They were given certain tasks, the professional tasks. When the task is over, they were going back. I will give you some 2 or 3 examples. O'Shaughnessy I already mentioned. William Pole and the Alexander Strange is there. The third category of the scientists were there, that the native plus the supporters. They were not only Indian scientists like P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, Mahendralal Sarkar. There was also David Harre, who was the founder of the Hindu College, Father Lafont, who was a founder of the St. Xavier College, Samuelson, who was one of the founders of the Indian Science Congress. Nivedita was there, which was worked with the J.C. Bose, and later on who was associated with Gandhi. So they were a native plus the supporters, native scientists, and the supporters were in the third category of the scientists were there. So we have 3 categories of scientists. One is the gatekeepers like the Sir Thomas Holland. The second is the soldiers like William O'Shaughnessy, William Pole, Alexander Strange. And the third category is the natives and the supporters, who were very important for the emergence of the national science. And for example, in terms of the whole soldiers, we will come down to next slide, please. William Pole, he taught engineering at the Elphinstone College in the Bombay, helped the survey of the Great Indian Railway. On his return to England, he was employed in railway engineering and consulted by D. Lesseps on the proposal to dig a canal through the Suez. Pole went on to become the consulting engineer to the Japanese government and held a chair of engineering at the University College of London. So when I mentioned the gatekeepers, so he was the people like William Pole, who would work in India for a long period of time, who would become professionals, and when their task is over, they will just go back to the country. Next was the Alexander Strange. I am just making some examples, but there were a number of hundreds of people of these soldiers were there. Returning to England, Alexander Strange he was at the Trigonometrical Survey of India in 1861, established a large department on scientific instruments, inspection. Strange was elected the Fellow of the Royal Society in 1864. Nature in March 1876 observed that to him belongs the credit of appointing the Royal Commission in Scientific Institution as the advancement of science. Strange was instrumental in the establishment of the Ministry of Science in Britain. So you will find that many of those people were the 3 categories of the people. They were gatekeepers like Sir Thomas Holland, the soldiers who were given certain tasks, who goes back, and the third category is the native supporters and this thing. Some of the British scientists were also there, who were there. These are some of the racial examples which I've already given, and these are the 2, William Pole and the Alexander Strange, which I've already talked about. So break away from the colonial science from the 1876. What happens is that next slide, towards the national science, the phase begins with the establishment of the 1876 Indian Association of the Cultivation of the Science. As I already mentioned, that from 1870 to 1914, some basic institutions were created, and many of these basic institutions were created outside the colonial enterprises. And many of these institutions were funded from the Indian wealthy people and through the efforts of their own scientists. So from 1914 to 1940s, you will find a kind of a new phase of the national science begins, which also later on becomes a formation of the Indian scientific community. Now, what happens from the 1876? The 1876 Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. The first degree in science was established in 1898 from the Calcutta University. C.V. Raman comes to Indian Association of Cultivation of Science in 1907. A very interesting case. C.V. Raman comes to Calcutta as a finance officer. Every day he goes via front of the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, and since he's somehow a scientist, he wanted to do physics. So what he does is he takes a part-time job in the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. So in the evening after his work from the financial services, he comes and works. So over a period of 4 or 5 years, he does that, and later on he resigns from the Indian finance service and joins Indian Association of Cultivation of Science in around 1907 and 1908. After giving away his a job in the Indian financial services, then he works on. At that time, I already mentioned the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science was creating a base. It was translating, it was giving lectures. The people who were connected with it were doing popularization of the science, the translation work. And so they were creating a base and also trying to radiate the kind of the work from the other institutions within the country. Indian Association for the Cultivation of Science is very important by the Mahendra Lal Sarkar, because I'll just give one example. Because in terms of the whole objectives, Sarkar says that we should endeavor to carry on the work with our own efforts, unaided by the government. I want it to be entirely under our management and control. I want it to be solely native and purely national, you see. So that is the kind of the word he uses. You know, he says that we don't want to take any money from the colonial enterprises, because there was a whole lot of the discrimination and many of those things are there. You will find many of the people who were working in the Indian Education Service gets integrated with many of these institutions at between the late 19th century and by 1920s and 1930s. Already number of Indian School of Chemistry, Indian Physics, mathematics, and many of these societies, as we go on, we will look into that. So this institution, so this is the kind of the foundational objectives by which Indian Association of Cultivation of Science was created. The second example is the Satish Chandra Mukherjee, a leading educationist of Bengal, launched the Dawn Society in 1902 to promote the idea of the national education, which transformed into the National Council of Education in 1906. Taraknath Palit launched the Society for the Promotion of Technical Education in 1906. Established the Bengal Technical Institute, which later on becomes the Jadavpur University. 1910, the two groups joined to establish the Jadavpur University. The Calcutta College of Science was created, where M.N. Saha, who was at the Allahabad University, who created the ionospheric school, comes back to Calcutta College of Science and Technology at a later stage. P.C. Ray was also there. That with 24 lakhs of rupees from Taraknath Palit and Ras Bihari Ghosh. Imagine in 1902, 1910, 24 lakhs, I don't know how many hundreds of crores that will be at the present this thing. 24 lakhs were given for the creation of the chairs and the Calcutta College of Science and Technology. Bengal radiated other regions. Pune Sarvajanik Sabha led to the Indian National Congress to adopt the resolutions for the creation of the technical education in the country. So this is also the beginning of the kind of the political struggle and the science struggle which goes on. And you will find that many of the Indian eminent scientists had close relations with Gandhi and Nehru and Bose and many of those people. Some of the institutions which were created at this particular point of time, some of the I will mention. The J.C. Bose Research Institute was very important, 1917. St. Xavier College, where a lot of basic research in astronomy, astrophysics was going on in 1860, it was created. We all know that the J.R.D. Tata created the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Mysore Maharaja has given a lot of this thing. The whole food research, this thing came from Mysore to the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore there in 1907, and by 1940s even Raman gets back to Indian Institute of Science. Calcutta College of Science and Technology was established between 1917 and 1920 with the donation of this thing and creation of the chairs. Between 1857, already 3 universities the British established in the presidencies, but the 6 universities at Allahabad, Punjab, Banaras, Mysore, Patna, Osmania, and 45 affiliated colleges. Now, these 6 universities and the 45 affiliated colleges were created outside the colonial scientific enterprises. And these Osmania was created by the Nizam in there. You will find in Banaras, Banaras Hindu University was created, where Madan Mohan Malviya was there. The Kala Bhavan in Baroda, which later on becomes the MS University of Baroda. Between 1910 and 1920s, Indian universities, including those in the presidency towns, awarded about 2,000 degrees in all sciences. This is the Mahanlobi's data. In 1914, Indian Science Congress led to the proliferation of 28 scientific societies by 1930. These are some of the institutions which were there: Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, Indian Association of Cultivation, Indian Science Congress Association in 1914, Calcutta College of Science in 16, Bose Research Institute, establishment of 6 universities. So these are between 1880 and 1930. This is the period where you will find that many of these institutions were created. Between 1876 and 1905, 1912. You will find that support structures were created, and some of these institutions were created. And after 1914, now this table is very important. The next slide, please. You will find that the publication on science in Indian languages in the provinces of India between 1875 and 1896. This is the data from one of the PhD thesis, history of science PhD thesis I have taken. And you will find in different provinces in Madras, Bombay, Punjab, and Northwest frontier, Pakistan and Bangladesh was very much part of India at that particular point of time. You will find in medicine, mathematics, natural sciences, you will find nearly about 2,124 books were translated into different languages. This is only the data, but 3 or 4 times the kind of literature translation were going on at that particular point of time. So what you will find, a new phase beginning from, next slide please, from 1914, Indian Science Congress, which is a very important body which was created by, again, 2 Britishers, Samuelson and one more colleague. Beginning of the establishment of, this is the kind of the beginning of the establishment of not only the national science, later on it becomes we can talk about the Indian scientific community, untenable with the colonial science enterprises and services. So much of Indian scientists struggle to establish institutions and to do research. Indian scientists begin to professionalize science and advance science from the Indian soil. As I mentioned, that professionalization also means creating societies in the journals. You will find that as we go on, we will try to look into the kind of the professionalization of the science. And in the Indian Science Congress, what happens is that the chemical society, the physical society, the geological society, many of these societies which were created in the part of the Indian Science Congress. And every year from 1914, you will find that there was a whole tradition which is even now continued. Even now, Prime Minister Modi goes to the Indian Science Congress and spends the time. This was the kind of the tradition started by Jawaharlal Nehru at that particular point of time in 1914 by the politicians who were very much part of the political struggle against the British colonialism, who used to come to the Indian Science Congress, and there was a kind of the whole alliance between science and politics begins from the Indian Science Congress at that particular point of time. It also gave a kind of a platform for the scattered Indian scientists and the scattered Indian community to come together and to have this sense of a feeling of professional standing and professional society. So Indian Science Congress sort of stood as a great platform for the beginning of the national science and later on for the conversion of the Indian scientific community. You will find that next slide, please. This is the photograph of Mahendra Lal Sarkar, who founded the Indian Association of Cultivation of the Science. Next slide, please. This is the St. Xavier College, 1880, which was created in Calcutta. This is J.C. Bose. Next slide, please. Now, J.C. Bose, who was a technologist as well as a plant physiologist, it is said that microwaves were created, were first reported by J.C. Bose in 1895. He demonstrated in Calcutta, but he did not patent. So after 3 or 4 years, Marconi patented the microwaves, and so he could not get that patent priority. Actually, Nivedita, who was working with him, insisted to patent, but he believed in open science. He believed in professional basic science, science for everyone. So he did not. Those were the kind of the values which were upheld by some of those elite scientists. And Bose, this is the Bose Institute. Actually, he created this institute structurally in the image of a temple, and there were many instruments which were innovated by the Bose Research Institute, and they gave all Sanskrit names. Lack of time, we will not go into some of those details. Bose, between 1900 and 1920, came up with the group on the plant physiology. There was the whole research group came up under Bose Research Institute. With J.C. Bose as the leader. In 1900, he wrote a very important monograph on the generality of the molecular phenomena produced electrically in living and the non-living matter. Bose published 4 monographs, plant responses as a means of physiological investigation. There were 315 experiments. There was a whole lot of research which was going. 1917, the Bose Research Institute launched its own journal called the Transactions of the Bose Research Institute. The next is next slide, please. Next is the Prafula Chandra Ray, PC Ray. We all know that PC Ray was the father of Indian chemistry, and actually PC Ray is also can be seen as the father of Indian history of science. Between 1907 and 1908, he wrote 2 volumes of history of Hindu chemistry. And in the history of Hindu chemistry, he wanted to prove to the European big dad Berthelot in chemistry that science is not alien to India. The epistemological roots of modern science can be traced back into the medieval period. Prafula Chandra Ray also was the founder of the Bengal Chemicals and the Pharmaceuticals Limited. He was also a great Sanskrit scholar who translated 12th and 13th century chemistry texts, Rasendra Chintamani and the Rasa Prakasa Sudhakara. The whole purpose was to show that there was a continuing chemical tradition going on from the medieval to the modern period. So one of his main theses was to show that the modern science is not alien to India, which was the kind of the thesis by George Basala, some of the Eurocentric British and the other scientists who were. So he was a great personality, and you will find that Prafulla Chandra Ray's, he used to sleep in the laboratory actually most of his time, and a great personality. Great Indian scientist. And even S.S. Bhatnagar, who is a founder and one of the first director generals of CSIR, in one of his memoirs said that he did not study under P.C. Ray, but he always considered himself as the kind of a grand pupil of P.C. Ray. That was the kind of impact he had. Almost from 1915 till about 1940s and the 50s, till UDCT and the great institution of UDCT came up, where Ambani, one of the Ambani brothers, comes out from the UDCT Bombay. You will find, you talk to any eminent Indian chemist, will say that was influenced by P.C. Ray at that particular point of time. And they have recorded that even M.N. Sharma, who was head of the UDCT, mentions in many of the lectures. So P.C. Ray was a great personality, and there were a number of books and other things. As I mentioned, that he is not to be credited only as the a kind of the father of Indian chemistry, because he wrote these two great books on the history of Hindu chemistry, 1906 and 1907. He is to be credited also as the father of the Indian historian of science. Then you will find C.V. Raman, who comes as the finance officer, who does research at the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, along with Krishnan, and who was also there, who was later on becomes the director of the National Physical Laboratory. 1930 gets the Nobel Prize. So Indian Association of Cultivation of Science from 1920s, 1910, after doing fantastic work in the translation of science and creating some basic structures, works on basic research to the extent that India's first Nobel Prize you will find coming out from the Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. The Jamshed Tata, though he was kind of not a scientist, but a great founder of the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, which is a great institution, which is doing such a lot of good work in the last 40 or 50 years. Next slide, please. So you will find by 1930 specialist groups beginning contributing to what is known as, for the first time, Indian science community. When you talk about Indian science community, it is the kind of the Indians who were creating science institutions, who were creating universities, who were advancing science from the soil here. And after 25 years of the support structures, there were the kind of the professionalization which went on. They were able to create schools in physics, chemistry, mathematics, astronomy, and plant physiology, advancing science from Indian institutions outside the colonial enterprises. You know, that was a very important point. Indian Science Congress Association, where sections and societies were created, and these societies later on created number of journals. What today you have the Indian Chemistry, Indian Chemical Society Journal, and Indian Physical Society Journal, and some of those they had their origins in the Indian Science Congress. Of course, these days there is a lot of criticism of the Indian Science Congress that it has become a kind of not a very serious science talks goes on. But at that particular point of time, it was very eminent, very highly respected till about the in those particular days. And 1930s is also the period National Institute of Sciences, which later on becomes Indian National Science Academy, and there's a National Academy of Sciences which was created by Raman in the 1940s, Indian Academy of Sciences which was created by M.N. Saha, who was in the Allahabad University, who created one of the leading groups in this thing. In Banaras, in the university, there was a mathematics group. We will look into some of those things. The Indian Science Congress Association, now this is the table which looks in the members. In 1914, there were 79 members. By 1950s, that is the 1940s, you will find 2,200 members were created, which had a phenomenal increase at that particular point of time. In terms of the presentation of the papers, mind you, many of these papers got into the international journals, highly rated international journals. There were 114 members in 1915, which went on to 765 people by 1950, 678 by 1940s. So this is the kind of the growth of the journals you will find from 1900. You see the blue kind of this thing taking off after 1900 in terms of the whole journals. The next slide, please. This is the period which gives the journal, where basically the journals which had their origin from the Indian Science Congress. 1820, there were only 2 journals. 1850, there were 4 journals. By 1900, there were 10. By 1920, you will find by 1940s and 1950s, 50 journals, quite important journals which were created. Now, this is a slide which basically talks about number of people led by P.C. Ray, Watson, Niyogi, Datta, Rakshit. Number of people are there and are there, which is basically the Indian School of Chemistry. In the first column is the number of the scientists, almost about 18 to 19 scientists are there. The period of activity is given in the next column, the number of publications. The P.C. Ray between 1894 and 1920 has 107 publications, collaborating with 37 researchers. So in the 1920s, you could see this is the kind of the table. Again, this is taken from one of the presidential addresses and the papers of P.C. Ray. So Indian School of Chemistry was already created by 1920s. Now this is 1930s. By 1930s, Indian School of Physics is already created. Between 1901 and 1946, it gives a total number of the papers which were there, the single author papers, and the collaboration coefficient of these, which is given through the scientometric data. Then, of course, it was led by C.V. Raman and M.N. Saha, who was another great personality from Calcutta. There was, this is the next slide, please. The photographs, we're just going through the photographs. This is Raman and this is the physics who created the sort of Indian School of Physics. We had Srinivasa Ramanujam, Srinivasa Ramanujam, who's in mid-30s, who departed, who was a port trust clerk, who was a born mathematician, who wrote papers, who sent to Cambridge. He was invited by Cambridge, the number theories, who becomes an FRS fellow of the Royal Society at the age of 32. He dies somewhere in the mid-30s. So is a kind of a separate case, but you will find that the Indian mathematics flourished at the Banaras in the university, and later on at the other institutions in Madras and other universities. So Indian school, there was no such thing as Indian school of mathematics, just like we had for chemistry and plant physiology and physics, but there were a number of mathematicians who were of a very high degree who could get a big name. By 1944, there were 10 fellows of the Royal Society whose work, who basically these were the people who, like M.N. Saha, P.C. Ray, and many of these people who did work in India, who were became members of the Royal Society, and who could get that, who could put India at the international sphere of science. So what you will find from the late 19th century to the 1940s is not only the inauguration of national science, but what is known as the Indian science community comes about. This is a very important. If you see the kind of the colonialism, the French in Africa, the Spanish in Latin America, then the Portuguese in the Brazil, and in none of these countries in Africa, Latin America, anywhere, something called a national science community could emerge during the colonial period. India was a special case because the whole struggle for the independence by the political leadership was somehow had a parallel of the struggle by the Indian elite scientists like M.N. Saha, P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, and many of those people. So by 1940s, it is not only the inauguration of the national science from the colonial model, what we have seen from the discrimination in the center and the periphery, and the kind of the gatekeeping activity of the colonial science. You will find the inauguration of what is known as the national science, which went into the whole nation building process. And from there, what is known as the science community also came about. In 1931, you will find the National Planning Committee was being inaugurated. Actually, as they say, it was M.N. Saha who was to take over as the chief of the National Planning Committee. But given the kind of the National Planning Committee, which becomes the Planning Commission and now the Niti Aayog, at that particular point of time, M.N. Saha says that it was a politician should become a head of the National Planning Committee. So he says that the Nehru should take over as the head of the National Planning Committee. And there were other scientists, P.C. Ray and many of the other scientists who were very much part of the National Planning Committee, which played a great role in terms of the whole industrialization process. And 1931 is also the period when the total independence question comes up after the Lahore Congress. So what happens in the 1931, 1932, 1933, that one day or other India will gain independence and we have to plan nationally. So the whole planning and the industrialization for the free India begins somewhere in the 1936 and 1937. Between 1930 and 1947, because of the total independence, the consolidation, the expansion of the S&T institutions and the universities begin. Towards the end of the period, you will find that when it was certain after the end of the war, when the 1945 Government of India invites A.V. Hill. A.V. Hill was the scientific secretary of the Royal Society to report, to give a report on the post-war reorganization, the post-war period, which he produces a report in 1945, which is a very important report, A.V. Hill report, which is called the kind of a model of science and technology in India, the whole organization model of the science and technology in India, which was based on the British DSR model, is accepted by the Nehru in 1945. You will find by that time, you will find that India is already established a kind of a big mark in the international sphere of science. You will find that Nehru taking a lead right from the 1920s and the 1930s. After 1920s, even Gandhi comes into the picture. You will find that so what you will find is a kind of a new alliance between the science and politics emerges from the National Planning Committee in 1931, by which already what is known as the Indian scientific community is already created. And as early as 1938, as we all know, that Nehru becomes a very important figure, and the kind of the modern science and technology what we have today is taken roots at that particular point of time. And the kind of the quote from Indian Science Congress in 1938 by Nehru is very, very important. He said, and I quote, "It is science alone that could solve these problems of hunger and poverty, of insanitation and illiteracy, of superstitions and deadening custom, of tradition, of vast resources running to waste of a rich country inhabited by starving people." Now, this is what he said. So he inaugurates a kind of a new alliance between the science and the politics, and for a kind of a new model of the science and technology in the country. After the A.V. Hill accepted the A.V. Hill report, he becomes the prime minister because Gandhi supported him to the this thing. So towards my concluding remarks, I'll take a couple of minutes to conclude with these concluding remarks. So as a kind of a criticism, you will find that with the inauguration of the national science, with the kind of an independent scientific tradition emerged, established outside the colonial scientific enterprises, which was a kind of a criticism to the Basala's three-stage model of the colonial science. And in terms of the cultural kind of a viewpoint, modern science, what P.C. Ray, J.C. Bose, and many of those people talked about, the modern science is not alien to the Indian culture. The epistemological roots of the modern science can be traced back to the medieval period, even to the ancient period, because there was something called the Dark Ages in the Europe. It was not Dark Ages in India at that particular point of time. So the epistemological roots of the modern science can be traced back to the Indian traditions in the ancient and the medieval times. The history of the Hindu chemistry is there. At the same time, the kind of the what P.C. Ray mentions in the history of Hindu chemistry is very, very important. He also shares that while he criticizes the caste system in India, he criticizes many of the dysfunctional aspects of the Indian culture. He also says that we had a very great ancient and the medieval traditions in the science, but we should not glorify the past. Is very dangerous and spoils the image of Indian science to the contribution. Now, this is what P.C. Ray says that is very important, I think. So Indian science community emerges by 1930s. Nehru's imprint on science and technology for development is there. Laid a long-lasting foundation for basic science and the base for innovation in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for a beautiful lecture with a lot of supported data. You very beautifully explained that how Indian science emerged outside the colonial enterprise, and how our ancient, colonial period scientists actually perform various activities, publication in terms of publications, institutions, and all that. It is time for questions. So, I have a couple of questions in my mind. So, I'll be taking liberty of moderation, and I'll first ask two questions to you.
Yeah.
First question will be if we'll compare colonial period and post-colonial period. So, do you feel something is missed out, and the way our colonial period scientists were performing, probably that kind of performance, despite of the fact that that time the conditions were quite adverse, does not seem like now?
You see, that was a very important phase where you will find at one level, from late 19th century, you will find the first chunk of Indian nationalists, economic nationalists, the Dadabhai Naoroji, Ranade, Tilak. Many of those people began their struggle toward the British colonialism. On the science side, there was another struggle going on, because these people felt completely stifled coming from with, for instance, PC Ray was vice president of the Edinburgh Chemical Society. He comes back to India. He is an ordinary person in the provincial educational services, not allowed to do basic research, no labs, nothing. He was a great scientist in Britain. Yeah? So they're fired by that imagination. That commitment is there. So the kind of the nationalism is, those values were very high. So there is a whole passion for doing something for the country. So obviously you will not find that kind of a spirit in the post-colonial period, which is kind of this thing which is there. One of the problems which one can find from that period and this period is also that somehow now, if you see Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, it was a very eminent center. There were people like C.V. Raman, there were people like Saha, there were people like so many K.S. Krishnan, so many people were there and they were doing front-ranking research. Now that was not institutionalized properly, you see. M.N. Saha was at Allahabad University, was one of the world's leading centers in terms of the ionospheric school was there. So once M.N. Saha comes to Calcutta, the whole group crumbles, So it was not institutionalized. If you see MIT, if you see Princeton, it is the persons become unimportant. It is the system becomes very important. It is the kind of the merit. It is the kind of the culture. It is the kind of the organizational structures in science which becomes very important. Unfortunately, both in that period and in the post-colonial period, you will find that once the personality leaves, you will find that the groups getting crumbled. That doesn't mean that there are no institutions where institutionalization has taken place. For instance, if you see the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, where Bhabha was there, he was very, very keen that no matter what happens, that we will select the best person and we will build institutions and we will build the research groups around these persons. And no matter what happens, the persons go, but the eminence of that institution continues for a long period of time. Similar traditions were built in the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, right from the Raman's days. But because of the kind of the conflict between somehow South Indian and M.N. Saha, that's another kind of the whole phase which is there. Somehow that couldn't stand in terms of the IACS, Indian Association of Cultivation of Science. So this is one of the problems which you can find in that period and this period. But in terms of the passion, that was great there. That kind of a passion is very difficult to create now, actually. You will find there are some scientists like our Abdul Kalam used to sleep in the laboratory, so who was a missile scientist. And so there are people, so there are eminent scientists. It is not that we have not done, but there are some other problems are there. We can get into another one and to some of those issues. Yeah, you had another
and as you rightly pointed out that the kind of struggle on political and economic fronts were happening, scientists were actually involved in same kind of struggle in field of science. But people from political and economic diaspora, they got a lot of recognition in general public mind. Scientists did not get that kind of recognition. Why that happened? Is there a particular reason?
You mean during the colonial period or during the?
I'm talking about colonial period specifically. Okay. So in colonial period, yeah.
You see, if you say compare now P.C. Ray and Gandhi, and P.C. Ray was a Gandhian actually, and so the political struggle and achieving independence was so important, not only to the kind of the self and the nation. That was a kind of a very big kind of an agenda, So these many of the political personalities, whether it is Gandhi, whether it is Tilak, whether it is any of those persons who were eminent thinkers in their own right, definitely they had a much more, because that was the kind of the thing which was there. So in the people's imagination, so they were able to sort of become a big figure, you see. So it was the kind of the whole the concept of nation, the whole concept of struggle, and the whole concept of struggle for independence was so long. It went on from the late 1880s till 1947, which is such a long period. Science was a very small part of it, if you say, if you think from there. So that's why you will find they were role models. The politicians have become role models, compared to the scientists. So that may be one of the reasons, the political issue was one more important than the other science at that particular point of time.
So
In the general imagination of the ordinary people, yeah.
So, a related question actually. This
Sir,
came from
Rituji, if you allow, may I ask a couple of questions?
Okay,
with
sure.
the permission of Rituji.
Sorry, I got tempted with your lecture, so I asked so many questions.
Yeah. So first of all, I would like to congratulate you, Dr. Krishna. It was such a comprehensive talk. You touched various domains and really enlightening. Whether it is about the scientists, about the institutions, about the societies created and the colonial model. I just wondered, like you have said very correctly, that there were two kind of science. One was at peripheries and one at the metropolis. And the peripheries was like for the colonies, and metropolis was for the British. But I just try to understand, when we have this kind of clear understanding, like what kind of science they were offering to us, why after independence our educational institution didn't address that issue. We are still, our educational system was working on the peripheries. I took the case of Pandit Madan Mohan Malviya, who had the vision of creating Banaras Hindu University. And like he has his own vision for the industrialization of independent India, but those views were not taken into account. Why couldn't we establish our own system where we train our own brains as per the Indian requirement, rather than again working at the peripheries? That is the one. Second thing, I put the questions in a go so that you can. The other thing, when they introduced modern medicine, I think that time Western medicine was, quite new. Even to the Western society, it was new. It was not very old. On the contrary, Indian Ayurveda system, which is thousands of year old, well established, and when we say that they have, the real scientific acumen, why didn't they try to integrate the two medicine, medicinal disciplines, Ayurveda or allopathy? Why couldn't they pick up, or they didn't want to try the evidence-based studies which we talk about today? Why didn't they explore Ayurveda, scientifically much more, or integration? Particularly in the time of COVID, we are talking of Ayurveda and Unani, all kind of medicine. So these are just like my queries or my curiosities, I will say. Thank you so much.
The first one on the peripheral science is actually at that particular point of time, because of the kind of the content of the scientific research which was done at that particular point of time. For instance, I told you the Geological Survey of India, which was one of the largest organizations, for a long time, till the First World War, they were not working on iron ore actually. That's why the steel industry could not develop in the country. What they were doing was only the coal surveys. The coal was very important for transportation and for mineral resources, for the raw materials which were transported back to this thing. So they had to develop those technology projects of railways and other things, And in terms of the coals also, they did not establish any basic research laboratories within the Geological Survey of India. In the beginning, the samples were sent to the Britain to the this thing. And when P.N. Bose, who was overtaken by Holland, and Medlicott, who was also much more qualified than them, wanted to work on the iron ore, he was not allowed, and he was to become the director of the Geological Survey of India. Later on, he joins the Tatas, and he starts the iron ore research. There are a couple of theses is there of P.N. Bose work in the whole iron ore. So you will find that kind of a division of labor was there. You will find that even the names of those organizations like Botanical Survey of India, Zoological Survey of India, it was most of a data gathering activity which was done by so I told you there were people like Medlicott and Sir Thomas Holland who was gatekeepers, who would gatekeep, who would promote science in those colonial enterprises only to some extent, not beyond professionalization. You see, so they will not. So that was the kind of the frustration by many of the people, Indian eminent scientists in 1880 and 1890s and 1900. Hundreds of them came back from Britain and Europe with PhDs who feel really suffocated, and that's why they struggle to create those years. So the division of labor was there, definitely, but that division of labor disappears by 1940s and the 50s in some institutions. Of course, there were enclaved institutions like Indian Institute of Science Bangalore, Indian Association of Cultivation of Science, and you will find by 1950s, you see, already I think Tata Institute of Fundamental Research is already created by Homi Baba there. By 1947 is already created, and you will find that another 10 universities were already created by that particular point of time, and you will find that one of the major, actually it doesn't become a peripheral science by 1940s. You will be surprised that the 6 IITs, the original IITs which were created, they were created because of the Sarkar Committee in 1947, and Nehru goes out of his way to mobilize many of these Indian institutes of technology at that particular point of time, gives some basic money and CSIR, because there were no laboratories, hardly laboratories by the 1942, 1945, 1946. But Bhatnagar creates more than 12 to 14 laboratories by the time he departs, around 1958 or something like that. You also talked about education, incidentally, Bhatnagar, a very important personality, and I think one of the most prominent after Homi Baba, I can say, who was secretary to the Atomic Energy Commission at that particular point of time, head of the CSIR, secretary to the Government of India, and chairman of UGC. The whole period he becomes, and there was a point when M.N. Saha comes in conflict with Bhatnagar, and because M.N. Saha wanted to create something like National Science Foundation, you see, outside the governmental machinery. These days we are talking about National Research Foundation. Again, there is a talk outside outside DST, something akin to the National Science Foundation. At that particular point of time also, right from 1940s and to 1950s, Saha wanted to create a national this thing outside this thing, but Bhatnagar says no, there is a limited money is there, so we cannot do that. So he comes to such a conflict that Saha comes in conflict with Bhabha on the one hand, he comes in conflict with Bhatnagar, he comes in conflict with even Nehru. Rather, Saha goes to Calcutta to contest as independent and sit in parliament against in the opposition benches and supports Nehru on international affairs, but internally he opposes Nehru because he wanted to develop nuclear research in the universities. And who, when Bhabha creates the atomic energy, Saha goes to Calcutta to create Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics, you see, and Nehru supports him in that also, actually, you see. So it's a very unique kind of a this thing. And there are a number of private papers are there, where in one of my books on Bhatnagar, which I wrote, and where I give a quote of M.N. Saha, that he criticizes Bhatnagar because he doesn't give much money to the universities, because all the money is appropriated by CSIR and the universities are left dry and this thing without the money, which continues even till today. Even till today, you will find that more than 55% of the total SCI publications produced from India are from the universities, but they get only 4% of the gross expenditure on the research and development. You see, they are contributing more than 55% of the publications, but they get only 4% or 5% of the gross expenditure on research and development. That means only 50 or 60 research universities are there. The rest of the universities are just teaching universities. So actually, in the post-independence period, it was no more a division of peripheral science. India, you will find that the CSIR, which did a great work in terms of the post-colonial period, you will find that in the pharmaceuticals, if India has become a pharmaceuticals backyard for the whole world, it's also because of the CSR contribution, because we had about 5 chemical labs, chemical or labs which are there, and many of the much of the kind of the technological capabilities which existed in the Reddy laboratories, in the UDCT, in many of the labs went from the CSIR, so a lot of work is done, and you will find in many of things, we can get into many of those discussions later on. But to come back to your other question of modern medicine versus Ayurveda, you see, Ayurveda is based on a worldview which is a independent person. You see, if you go to a real Ayurveda person, it's individual based. You see, the worldview is individual based, and the modern medicine is not individual based. It is a kind of this thing. So integrating, the integration is a very big problem. Suppose one can testify for the scientific rationality whether a particular Ayurvedic drug, what kind of a scientific basis it has, that's okay. But to adopt the kind of the scientific principles which are there in the modern medicine, to put that in Ayurveda becomes a bit problematic to the Ayurveda specialists themselves, because it is a worldview which is based on individual this thing, experience, and the kind of the whole this thing. Their whole pharmacopoeia is completely different. But if you are looking into rational scientific this thing to see whether it has any scientific basis, that is a very valid question, which is Ayush is doing that. Ayush is doing that. Suppose if somebody says that you have a medicine for certain things, it will have to be sort of have a evidence-based medicine. It has to have an evidence base, otherwise it will not have this thing, it will not work. But there are kind of knowledge which is there, which is individual based, you see, which is based on the individual physiological system which Ayurveda works. So it is very difficult for integration at that particular standpoint.
Yeah. Please. So
can I ask?
Yeah, he can come.
Please.
Yeah, Professor Krishna, it was wonderful listening to you. In fact, I really enjoyed the way you brought out how Renaissance in Indian science happened during those periods. What I had a quick question, which is a follow-up question of whatever Ruchir or Ranjana ji asked,
Yeah.
is when we talk about the movement from scientists in the struggle for freedom.
Yeah.
What I understand from what you have actually said is that we have slowly displaced the colonial imprints by our scientists. That is what comes out from what you have said. I mean, if I actually try to simplify what you said, so we have tried to establish ourselves in the try to push the colonials out of it so that we started getting recognitions like FRS you showed, that is a recognition given to bring you into their regime. So
Yeah.
in a sense, they couldn't displace you, so they tried to take you in. So this is how it has happened. And the reason why we do not see this as a freedom struggle, or it is not there, is it because it is in a small pockets which had happened, and didn't go pan India, compared to a political struggle where it was pan India and it had an influence larger than that. So could
Yeah.
we say that that is why we could not see the real movement which was happening from the scientific regime?
Yeah.
This is a follow-up of what Richard was also asking.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
and one
think.
of the viewers is also asking the same question what you are asking. So, I mean, thanks for
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Definitely, it was it's a very important question you have asked. That definitely it was not a all India development which we will see. That neither the complete colonial administration of science was indigenized. It was not necessarily done. If you see at the end of my talk, I talked about the A.V. Hill report. A.V. Hill was basically a scientific secretary of the Royal Society, and what he produced was a DSIR model. Actually, DSIR abandoned it in Britain in by 1970s. We still continue with the governmental science, and the kind of the some kind of indigenous blueprints which were given by M.N. Saha, Madan Mohan Malavya, where Ranjana ji also mentioned. Madan Mohan Malavya gave a 120-page critique to the Indian Industrial Commission of 1918, you see, which is a great document, actually, the historians have analyzed. In that, he gave a whole this thing about how we could further indigenize the whole science administration and many of these things, who would agree a lot with M.N. Saha, who wanted to also have a kind of a different council for science and outside this thing. Similarly, in terms of industry, there was a Visvesvaraya model, actually. Visvesvaraya, who was a great engineer from Mysore, and who resigns from the colonial administration, and who wanted to develop in a different engineering model and give a lot of emphasis on engineering, and also to the technological projects, and to do innovation, and do a lot of reverse engineering to do. Even that was completely overtaken. And also, there were a number of we have the whole Gandhian model itself was there, where Gandhi said that if villages perish, India perishes too. In 1870s, Gandhi and Kumarappa, they gave a blueprint in terms of the whole appropriate technology movement, which we will see, which we have seen. The Gandhian model was again a decentralized model, and where, as people say, he was not anti-science, but who wanted to reject that form of industrialization which leads to alienation of labor. So if there is a labor displacement, he wanted to. So from Gandhian to Visvesvaraya to M.N. Saha to Madan Mohan Malavya, there were a number of these visions were there, if you would like to call it a vision of science and vision of science, technology and development in the country. Unfortunately, what happened was that it was the dominant position of Nehru, who becomes so dominant that he develops a close alliance between science and politics immediately after the independence, beginning from the 1930s. When you accept the thesis that there is an alliance, there has to be people outside the alliance. Who were the people who inside the alliance? Homi Baba was there, D.S. Kotari was there, S.S. Bhatnagar was there. Who were people outside the alliance? C.V. Raman was outside the alliance. M.N. Saha was outside the alliance, who fought Nehru as an independent from this thing and sits in the parliament. Then Kosambi was there from who did not get along well with Homi Baba in Tata Institute. So and the very Gandhian blueprint was overtaken by Nehru, actually. You see, if you see the memoirs of B.P. Paul, who was the Director General of Indian Council of Agriculture Research, in one of his memoirs, B.P. Paul says, I hope that Nehru should have been associated with agriculture research from the 1940s, 50s, like he was associated with atomic energy. India wouldn't have struggled for the kind of the Green Revolution after 1970s. We had to wait till Mrs. Gandhi and C. Subramaniam, who's the real architect of the Green Revolution. This is what B.P. Paul says, who's the grand scientist. So you see, Nehru was, there's a positive aspects of Nehru and there are negative aspects of Nehru's pattern of development, you see, where you will find that there were a lot of, so he had this unbound optimism about science, you promote modern science and even at the neglect of the rural India, you promote institutions, the development flows, because that whole percolation theory got somehow aborted after that. So in a way, there were a lot of pockets where you will find indigenization of science and science administration were there. But unfortunately, they could not get currency, because Nehru's whole model of development, Nehru was there were hardly anybody to oppose Nehru, till 1960s and 70s. He was you will find that Nehru was so ardent supporter of planning in India. He brings in Mahanlobis into this thing. J.C. Ghosh becomes the planning commission member. But first science and technology plan comes only in 1974. You see, why? Precisely because there was a close alliance between science and politics. The people who were very close with Nehru, they were able to expand their science organization unboundedly. C. Bhatnagar, who had the power of just walking into Nehru's room and telling him, sir, you sign this file, I have to get this building from Mysore Maharaja, So that was the kind of the clout. Homi Baba was so powerful, he could take headquarters of Atomic Energy Commission to Bombay, actually. You see, that is how Saha gets totally frustrated and he wants to build Saha Institute of Nuclear Physics in Calcutta, and whose whole idea was to develop nuclear research in universities, is completely taken over by, so there were kind of a lot of, this is another debate, talk about Nehru versus Gandhi and this thing. So there were many positive and negative aspects about Nehru's pattern of development. You will find that which was suppressed the whole indigenization, and in terms of the whole administration, we continue to follow the British administration. That doesn't mean that there were no eminent institutions. The eminent institutions were there. They were not peripheral institutions, but they were first-class institutions, like TFR was there. But the thing is, the other side of the coin became very empty. The whole rural innovation became empty till Janata Party comes in 1977.
That's true.
So now questions from viewers.
Yeah.
So one question is, despite of the fact that Indian colonial period Indian scientists did a lot for making India, making getting our country pride, and I mean, they do everything for Swatantrata in their own way. They were never recognized as freedom fighters or Swatantrata Senanis. What may be the reason?
You see, if you within the intellectual historians, the what we know as the social historians, among the ordinary people, definitely they were not recognized because they were not the political freedom fighters. They were doing a struggle, a different kind of an intellectual struggle against the British colonialism, and they stopped at that. You see, so it is not that they were going to jail because they were trying to do a part of the Dandi March, or they were part of the Quit India movement or something like that. So definitely you can't say that they were not Swatantra sign this thing, but definitely we in our intellectual history understanding, we have to give certain space to some of these people who struggled intellectually in terms of establishing and institutionalizing and professionalizing the science in India. It is a kind of a different kind of a struggle they have waged against the British colonialism, though it was not a political struggle. So you have to give some kind of a credit to them, and may not be in an ordinary in the perceptions of ordinary people, lame persons, you can do that, but in terms of the intellectual understanding of the whole thing, these people are recognized. You see, PC Ray is recognized, CV Raman is recognized, MN Saha is recognized, and they have still a very big name. Still, there are many people who talk these days. They used to say our real golden period was in the pre-independence period. Where that golden period has gone. You see. So why do they say that? For the simple basic reason that we don't have a Nobel Prize in the post-independence period. If we have a Nobel Prize, and those people will have worked either in Canada or in Britain, you see, but not from our own soil or something like that. So we have only Raman as a kind of an example in terms of, or we have Rabindranath Tagore in terms of the whole literature, you see. So maybe for that reason, they will say that that was a golden period, and so we have not this thing. Of course, there are other factors which are there in terms of the whole thing, money and resources and the kind of this thing we have put into. But definitely, one should not. One should give a kind of from our own intellectual perspective. They have to be, these scientists have to be given some space as a kind of because who waged an important struggle.
We'll take one last question and then we'll move for presidential address. Was lack of exposure to their story, I believe he is talking about the story of colonial period scientists. So was lack of exposure to their story in today's education a contributing factor for the lack of passion, as you said, was there today?
Can you again explain this question?
Yeah, so I mean, what probably the viewer is asking, that in the education system, the colonial period scientists were not included the way they should be included. Was this the reason for not being a contributing factor for today's, or lack of passion for today's scientists?
No, I think you can't sort of relate it to the pre-independence period, because today, as I mentioned to you, that if you see the whole education system and the kind of the quality of teaching and the quality of the standards in the country, and the kind of the higher education in this country, you will find that we have more than 900 universities, and something like 45,000 colleges are there, and still we are not yet achieved what is known as the Humboldtian goal in education. You see, for the Humboldtian goal in education is the teaching and the research excellence combined together. You see, now these days people are talking about entrepreneurial universities, where teaching, research, and innovation is also part of the whole higher education system. As I mentioned, that hardly 4 or 5% of the total money of India's gross expenditure on research and development goes into universities. So more than, I think, 85% or 90% of the universities are teaching universities. There is not research intensive universities. The quality of teaching is also because you're not putting in money into infrastructure, not putting money into this thing. Suppose if you compare, I recently also published a book on the Chinese universities in the Chinese National Innovation System, Chinese universities in the National Innovation System, with the 3 Chinese collaborators. You just compare with China. We are far way behind this thing. About 15-20 years back, as early as mid-90s, China was producing 1/3 of India's science publications. Today they have overtaken us by 5 times, 4 times. And about 20 years back, none of the Chinese universities were part of the world-class universities. There were none of the Chinese universities were the top 100. Today they have 5 universities in the top 100, and something like dozen universities in the top 200. And the number will go high if you include Hong Kong into them. So that is because they have put enormous amount of money into higher education, research, and talents and building. So one of the problems of the whole teaching and this thing is, you see, atomic energy trains their own scientists now, and space research trains their own scientists now. Many of the eminent software companies are doing in-service training for the whole people. Now you look into the whole 4th industrial revolution of IoT, robotics, and many of these things. The universities hardly the same IITs and the same IISc and same maybe some CSR institutions, and so the same institutions are doing. So the research intensity of the universities, that has not expanded. So the problem is somewhere there. The problem is we are hardly expenditure making of 0.7% of our GDP on research and development in the country, which is very, very low. Right from last 2 decades, including the present regime, are saying that they will spend 2% of the GDP in the science and technology, but it is going down. From 0.9 in 20 years back, 15 years back, now we are doing 0.65 or 0.7% of GDP. And this is taken away by 55% of that money is taken away by 4 strategic agencies, atomic energy, space, and defense research organizations. So the problem of resources, the problem of putting more money into it, and so there's so many other problems. The problems are not in terms of the pre-colonial this thing.
Fine, thank you. So now I'll request Professor Chandrabhas Narayan to deliver the presidential address. Professor Chandrabhas Narayan.
First of all, I would like to thank Vigyan Bharati and Viva, that is Viva, for inviting me to preside over this wonderful session. Professor Venni Venkata Krishna, Professor Ranjana Agrawal, Professor Ruchir Gupta, and my dear friend and Mananiya Jayant Sahasrabuddheji, and many other dignitaries who have been part of this wonderful program, third in the series. So as I came into this program with blank mind, so that I can assimilate what is the concept which we are actually suggesting. So what I'm going to say in next 5 minutes, because we have already taken a lot of time, So I don't want to keep the audience for a longer time. What my perception from the talk which Professor Krishna has given and all the discussions which happened is that before the colonial era, India practiced a science which was borderless. Today we talk about science is borderless, but actually we practiced a borderless science before colonial era. We never had something like it's my science, we do not want anybody else to know, was not the criteria. Even a common man used to be educated in science without his knowledge. He was given the science knowledge so that he can start thinking independently. He can come out with innovations. We don't realize that, but if you go back and look at the small things which used to happen in India in colonial times, we had huge amount of innovations which was happening, and this was all because we used to have a scientific bent of mind. That was existing, and that was the culture, and because it was never my science or anybody else's science, it was in our culture to distribute it together. But what happened during colonial era is questioning methodology. See, we never believed in methodology. We never recorded methodology. What Professor Ranjana asked was this exact question, that why Ayurveda is not is given the recognition of a modern science. Because we never ever believed in methodology. We believed in the end. That is, we wanted a solution, and that solution is the most important thing, not how we arrived at the solution. So this was being practiced pre-colonial era. Colonial era became a very systematic methodology, and how we arrived, deduced to a particular solution or science coming out of it. And that was the transition period. And that transition period took about 100 years, and we were actually not able to understand how to convince or do things in our science. And that is why you would see, and as what Professor Venkat Krishna has mentioned, is that slowly we started adapting to that kind of science. And when we started adapting to that kind of science, we started changing our perception, our way of argument, and we were not underprivileged. We were actually endowed with our knowledge, and we could actually do excellently in our chosen field of science. One of the examples when proves that we never believed in methodology is the mathematician Ramanujam, who actually never told how he arrived at his theories. He actually gave the theory, but he never told how it was. And even today, many of them are unsolved, and people are trying to solve them. So that is how we believed that we wanted to tell what world needed to know. And that transformation happened around 1870s or 1880s is when that transformation happened. But when that transformation happened, colonial people didn't want you to actually take over. So they started suppressing you. And that is where our scientists started revolting. And this is what is not coming out as a freedom struggle. Because we always believed in displacing and getting ourselves the space rather than trying to remove them completely. So there was a peaceful removal of the institutions or trying to proliferate our science. And that is how these institutions came. And these institutions which were built and to propagate freedom for anybody in India to practice science was the reason for these institutions to come. Discussions, methodologies, and robust science developed during this period of time. And that is why I would also say that this was the Renaissance period or the golden period of science, because this is when the scientists started uh, trying to get ourselves established. And again, here, the colonial bend of mind was, if you cannot throw away, in bring them into their fold. And that's what was my question, that they brought them into their fold by recognitions in their own establishments, so that they will not fight against them. So these are the ways to suppress the uprisal which happened. But they couldn't sustain it, and that is the reason why India, post 1947, could actually have an exponential change in the scientific wealth, even though we were financially at the lowest. From the GDP, when we were negative, uh, post independence, we actually didn't have money, but our science was still doing excellently well. So this is the silent revolution which happened, which doesn't get recorded in our memory, and this is what is the objective of these lectures. And I see that these lectures are bringing out those salient features in our science that needs to be inculcated, and people should be able to absorb it. And even today, we are looking for recognition, or we are looking for our ability to get noticed by a foreign country. But those people who have actually established themselves in science are the ones who have never bothered about that. They have developed their own science, they have developed what they wanted to do, and they have developed what the methodologies they want to do it. But follow the way a world of science which is existing now, adapting themselves. And so that is what we need to actually encourage younger generation to start thinking, is do not look for recognition from the west or east, but look for our own areas, develop ourselves, and develop our potential and our areas ourselves. And that's the way we would learn from the history, and that's the way we would like to actually go during, as we are approaching the 75th Independence Day. And science indeed is going to be the front runner in our development of India, and that we need to actually inculcate in ourselves. With that, I would like to thank all of you, and especially Ranjana ji and Jayant Saraswati ji, for actually thinking that I could be presiding over this function, and I could contribute in some way to this novel thought. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So now this is time to announce the next lecture of the series. Next lecture will be on Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, will be delivered by Dr. Amartya Datta from Indian Statistical Institute, Kolkata. And the program will be presided over by Dr. G.D. Yadav, who is President of Indian Chemical Society, established by Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray. Now at the end of the program, this is the time to thanks everybody. So first of all, I would like to say a sincere thanks to Professor V.V. Krishana, who delivered a beautiful lecture with very good facts. And despite the fact that this is the time at his place is, 4.5 hours away, so it will be close to 12:30 or so. So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for that. I'll also thank Professor Chandrabhash Narayanji, who came, listened the lecture patiently and presided over the program in a very good way. I'll also be thankful to the technical team who supported all this. Vigyan Prasad, who actually is involved in many things, many activities. Viewers who are patiently viewing this lecture and asking very important questions. and everybody who is making this event successful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Krishna. It's almost midnight and you are here with us. Thank you so very much. Thank you, Dr. Narayan. We are so pleased to have you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Krishna, we will be transcribing your lecture and I will be sending it to you so that you can have your say, and then we will, circulate it and put it in the form of book. We will be bringing out a book. Thank you so much. Thank you. Great.
So thank you so much, and we log off.